So thank you all for your generosity of time as we delve into such an important topic in advocating for our relatives to understand the importance of early cancer screenings and having options for treatment when there is a diagnosis, such as participating in clinical trials. We know that oftentimes our relatives are diagnosed at later stages when there are limited options for treatment. And we also know that right now, there are many who are not going in for their cancer screenings. That's causing significant effects or having a significant effect on our relatives who are experiencing cancer. So when we actually first started planning for this webinar and developing these questions, we were focused more on clinical trials as they related to cancer. But with all of the work on clinical trials for the COVID vaccine, we wanted to bring that information in to the conversation and use it to provide a better understanding of clinical trials overall and how it relates to cancer. So I'll start by asking Dr. Lee, the first question is for you. What is a clinical trial and what should listeners know about clinical trials?
Thank you, Wyatt. I believe we're going to share the screen with one of the resources that we are going to make available to all our participants and viewers. Great. I hope everyone can see that. So this is an information sheet that was developed by our colleagues through the Native American Cancer Prevention Partnership between the University of Arizona and NAU's outreach team. And the link is available on top, but I think they also might make it available after this presentation as well. But before I just start diving in and talking about clinical trials, I have a few questions that I want to direct towards our participants that may help clarify certain misconceptions or misunderstandings. So I can put them in the chat box, I believe, for the attendees, but I'll also read them out loud. This is me going back to my professor, asking questions, trying to have you engaged during the presentation. All right, so it's a true false question. If you want, you can type it in the chat. It's totally up to you. It's just something to think about, right? So true false, clinical trials only involve medications or therapeutics, such as the COVID-19 vaccine or potential new cancer medications. Again, you can type in the chat if you want. It's just to get you thinking about the question. All right. See lots of responses coming in. That's great. Everyone is saying false from what I can see right now. And that is correct, right? It's false. So for example, I did a quick search online to an available website, and there's actually over 1,600 trials that are recruiting right now, just alone in the state of Arizona. And these include not just medications or therapeutics, but also medical procedures and behavioral studies. And so one of the ones I was looking at looked at calming sleep study, and that was very interesting, especially to the stressed faculty life we've been experiencing through this pandemic. All right, so the second question, and again, I'll put this in the chat, is, all right, previously approved FDA medications and or commercially available products do not require a clinical trial to test its efficacy on any new diseases or outcomes. For example, the use of vitamins to treat COVID infections in cancer patients. This is just a hypothetical situation I came up with. All right, again, feel free to respond or not in the chat. So I see one response coming through right now, and so that looks correct. That is also false, right? If you look on the same list of clinical trials that are recruiting in the state of Arizona, you'll find that there's actually a study that is investigating the use of pomegranate juice, right? Something you can buy at the grocery store to influence the gut metabolites in nursing mothers. So again, So why is this, right? Why do we have to conduct a clinical trial in these type of situations, right? So why is the pomegranate juice considered a clinical trial? So the response to that is essentially is because clinical trials are research studies. And I think if you can scroll down on the website page, I think there's a little bit more, right? What do I need to know? Okay, right, so clinical trials are research, right? And so if you're asking new research questions, especially involving human subjects, you have to be able to go through the proper checks and balances with using a clinical trial, right? And clinical trials are meant for future patients. So while there may be some positive outcomes from individuals currently enrolled in a clinical trial, such as a cancer patient receiving a new type of medication or therapeutic, it's not always the case, right? It might not be beneficial for them, especially if they're involved in a clinical trial that has a placebo as a control, right? And so, for example, right, the COVID-19 vaccine trials include individuals receiving the vaccine, but there's also those that are receiving placebo, which is in most cases is a saline solution. So that's obviously not very beneficial for those individuals. All right, so what are the phases of clinical trials? Can you scroll back up for me briefly? Okay, thank you. So technically there are 4 distinct phases if you're not including the preclinical phase. So researchers like myself focus on the preclinical phase in the laboratory setting. This is where we're designing vaccines or therapeutics, and then we're testing them in the lab. A lot of times it could be in various animal models, depending on the disease that we're looking at. So clinical trials are initiated once an adequate animal data is collected and analyzed. And again, sometimes there may not be a specific animal model for that disease. So we're trying to gather as much as we can in animal studies before we actually start working with humans. So again, for example, the Moderna vaccine was first tested in non-human primates before it was actually entered into the phase 1 trials. So what are the different phases then? So when we talk about phase 1, right, this is intended to be a safety study, right? They're looking at the safety of whatever medication, therapeutic, it could be a procedure as well. And typically this involves a small number of healthy participants. And so again, that number can vary, but it's usually in a few dozen. In the case of the Moderna vaccine, they had 45 participants that were receiving different doses. So they started with a low dose, looked at it, that safety, and then increased doses across the study. After that, you then can enter into phase 2, which is still looking at safety, but also potential effectiveness. So once again, the numbers of participants can still vary, but they're relatively small. Each participant usually receives at this point the same dosage in the case of medications. You typically don't see placebos in the phase 2. For example, the Moderna vaccine had 600 participants, so a little bit larger than probably most phase 2 studies. But again, a placebo was not used in this incident. And then the phase 3, right, that's where we're at now, and that's what you're seeing in the case of the COVID vaccines. These are large numbers. Randomized and blinded are the gold standard. So what does that mean? What is randomized? What is blinded? So randomized meaning that once an individual decides to participate in a study, their information is entered into a computer, and then they're randomly selected on what type of treatment they get. So are they receiving the vaccine? Or are they not, right? And so that's to reduce the bias that could potentially happen. And then blinded, there's essentially two types. So one meaning you as the participant or the individual, you don't know what you're receiving, right? So that's called single blinded. And then there's a possibility that researchers are also blinded, so they don't know what you're receiving as well. And it's not determined until later, until the data is sort of analyzed and we can determine who's receiving what the control or the actual therapeutic. And then finally, there's a phase 4. This usually includes FDA approved medications or procedures, but it might be addressing additional research questions. And a lot of times they think this may be a more safer phase because at this point it's already been tested. They know the treatment or the procedure could be safe for individuals. So I talked about these clinical trials that we're seeing in Arizona. And so there's actually a website where you can see all ongoing recruiting trials in your local area, in your state, and then around the country. And so I'll just put the website in the chat as well. So it's clinicaltrials.gov. So this is for anybody to go and look and see what's going. So finally, if you or a loved one is considering a clinical trial, I would still suggest that you consult with your healthcare providers. If you have any health conditions, you can also review the website to see if you are eligible for the different clinical trials. Also, don't be afraid to ask any questions if you do decide to join a clinical trial during the consenting process. If you scroll down on the information sheet, there's actually a list of questions that are available that you might want to consider if you are going to decide to join a clinical trial. So that's the short and sweet of what a clinical trial is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. The second question is, we know that American Indians and Alaska Natives and other racial and ethnic minorities are often underrepresented in clinical trials. Dr. Herring, why is it important that American Indians participate in clinical trials? And I believe you sent me a resource that you wanted to pull up, so I'll get that shared on the screen as well here.
Okay, yeah, thank you. You can put it on the screen at any time. First, I want to just say, Nyawir, thank you for hosting this important conversation. Kudos to American Indian Cancer Foundation and all the work that you're doing across the country. And you know, the clinical trial piece is very important. And part of our role, Dr. Lee and Dr. Walters and I have been part of an Indigenous kind of panel of experts, so to say, of kind of sharing, you know, perspectives of Indigenous nations, Native nations. And, you know, I think that's really important to understand that, you know, one, that we've been invited to that conversation, and that these different agencies across the country are kind of honoring our voice in that way. And so the COVID prevention network is a host to a number of kind of agencies, from HIV prevention network to infection disease clinical research consortium, the AIDS clinical trial group, and also beyond that, it's part of Operation Warp Speed, which is interagency between NIH, HHS, Health and Human Services, CDC, FDA, and a number of other partners in the DoD, DOE, and VA, Department of Energy, and Veterans Association. So within all that, you know, the one piece that's, I think it's important to understand, is the Indigenous voice, and I think what we brought to the table, to the discussion of clinical trials and Native nations, was really the knowledge of sovereignty, right? So in being part of that, and that Native nations that are interested in being part of clinical trials are, has to be an understanding between nations, the U.S. and sovereign nations, or you know, the conversations that we also had, where it's not just U.S., but it's, you know, North America, it's Canada, and other Indigenous nations across the world that are part of the COVID-19 vaccine trials. And so to really share that concept with sovereignty to these companies that are creating the vaccines, but also to reinforce that concept of sovereignty to the agencies of the U.S. and that are kind of all working together under Operation Warp Speed. And so that was one of our contributions, was to really engage that conversation and make sure that it was part of the clinical trial conversation. And what that means to clinical trials is more inclusion into clinical trials. If you look at clinical trials um, in general over time, sometimes they don't always include minority populations, and not necessarily sovereign nations or different peoples of color, but also minority groups that are not always included. And this can be any population, from uh, people with disabilities or um, elders or other youth. So, it's really an important conversation for clinical trials, that the inclusion of Native nations and others are included in that conversation. And the importance of that is really that, with vaccines in particular, and also any kind of treatment, really, whether it be behavioral interventions or other pharmaceutical interventions or whatever it may be, is that the treatment, or the vaccine in this case, is only as good as robust as those that are involved in the clinical trials. So if you're creating a vaccine that is only normed for a non-native population, for example, well, we may know it may work good for that population, but when it's brought to another population, it may have different effects. So it's really important to consider or educate yourself on what that means to vaccines, and how the participation is important. And what Dr. Lee was sharing is really important, to go through those kind of bullet points and education pieces about what one, if you're interested in clinical trials, and that conversation, to really educate yourself. And I think that's really the important thing that we were kind of stressing over time, is that be an educated community member on what clinical trials are. Seek out information, and that we're sharing here infograph, that kind of a tip sheet on Native Americans and clinical trials, that breaks down on what that is, and maybe from an Indigenous perspective. And where to find out more about clinical trials is the same resource that was shared. And so, these are all important, not only to educate yourself as a community member, but also important information for tribal councils, for leadership, for urban executive directors and boards. So these are all good information to share out into the communities. So it really is uh, the importance of diversifying the science that comes out of clinical trials is important and relevant to how it is for our communities. And not only a community, again, the emphasis for our conversations too is not only the communities here in North America, but around the globe. And we did tie in some of the conversations around the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Human Rights, and what that conversation meant to clinical trials. So those are all important. And a third thing I will mention, or another thing I'll mention too, is that one of our uh, things that we contributed during the COVID vaccine trial discussion was more along the lines too of creating communication materials that were indigenized for our community members, making sure that um, the information that came out from the various uh, companies that were producing vaccines had indigenized or thought about indigenizing some of the recruitment materials that would make it more readable or understood by community members from Native communities. And that we wanted to make sure that that wasn't just kind of a blanket kind of outreach kind of mechanism, that that we were not necessarily pushing for clinical trials, but having the ability for our community members to have information that was to really gauge that decision whether uh, our nations would be interested in being part of clinical trials. And I know that the National Institutes of Health right now, as Wyatt had mentioned, is also or is going to mention, is also conducting a webinar with Dr. Fauci and Dr. David Wilson from the Tribal Research Health Office at NIH. almost at the same time we are. So that will be recorded and shared. And it's important that all this information is out there and that we share this among our communities. In that office of Dr. Wilson works for at NIH, Tribal Office of Research, has been coordinating with tribes from the Great Plains, predominantly from the Great Plains towards the Southwest and West, and has been connecting with tribes to be part of clinical trials and, more along the lines of educating and informing about the conversations that are occurring. So in that respect, some of the companies have really taken a kind of the knowledge that we've shared through these panels and have taken into consideration. I know that I believe it was Moderna really kind of stepped back a little bit, just a little bit, and came back with a diversified approach to recruit more minorities from different populations across the U.S. and globally. And the same is true with some of the other companies. So, it was really kind of this kind of hybrid approach of working with Indigenous panels, not only Native and Indigenous, but other expert panels from different populations to give insight and kind of conversation to that. So with that, I see that some of the vaccines that come out are a little more probably diversified because of that conversation we had in the beginning to encourage and educate some of these companies that are working in Operation Warp Speed and beyond, like Pfizer, who is independent of any kind of a governmental funding, but had consulted and worked in various Native nations to increase the population within the clinical trials. So that's important in clinical trial research, is to really have that diversity to make sure that it works for us. That I think it's important, but it's also, I'll also say that, to be part of a clinical trial, one, it's really gaining education, but two, it's kind of being courageous in a way too, that you really these are novel meaning that they're new, right? So at the same time, or it's kind of a courageous stance to really be part of clinical trials when it's so novel, but at the same time it's so important to be part of it in a way that we want to make sure that it's going to be good for our community. So the conversation is still going. Clinical trials will still be occurring, perhaps, and there's a lot of unanswered questions, right? And so as time goes on, the consideration, the education shouldn't stop on clinical trials. It should continue, because there's going to be more things that we don't know about. For example, cancer. There wasn't as many cancer patients that were part of the clinical trials overall because of the different stages of cancer, and that area needs to be examined a little further, as well as most of these vaccines were kind of gauged for an older population, so 18 and over. So to say that our youth, we don't know that, and then we don't know dissemination of information kind of post-pandemic and what that vaccine kind of will look like in kind of the area. So I know that there's likely going to be a phase 2 kind of funding support for some of those post-pandemic clinical trials. So that is also important. I just want to also say that some of the antigen testing is important too, to kind of, from an epidemiological standpoint, to kind of see where that's been across Indian country and what that means to our people. So a lot of unanswered questions, but a lot of science that has occurred really quickly. And I would say, it's something that happened because of something. But a lot of these synergies and education that hasn't been out there has now kind of brought forth into the world. And one of those key things that I think we've really shared is that sovereignty picture, and that our Native nations are sovereign and have the ability to make that informed, educated choice whether to participate. So again, thank you for having me, and I'll pass it on to the next. Yowie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herring. I think that perspective and the insight that you provide there is so important. And thank you to you and Dr. Lee and Dr. Walters for participating in that panel. I think it's so important for us as Indigenous people and Indigenous scientists to be at the table and making sure that our communities are represented and served in the best way, so that we're providing good education and information so that they can make the best decisions for themselves. And that really leads into my next question here, about that panel. So Dr. Walters, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Herring, and 9 other Indigenous scientists are part of the Native and Indigenous expert panelists, representing diverse areas of expertise, including biomedical and social and behavioral sciences, biostatistics, and ethics. The expert panelists are members of and working with and within priority communities, including Native and Indigenous. And so this is really exciting because it seems like it's kind of the first time, or one of the first times, that American Indian, Alaska Native experts are being consulted at this level. So can you share with us a little bit more about your participation in the COVID-19 prevention network, and just what you kind of bring to the table? And so we'll start with Dr. Walters.
Yes, hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to talk about this part because it is new and important, and building on the.
Sorry, Dr. Your audio is coming across a little like staticky, and it's a little hard to hear you.
Okay, how is it now?
It's okay.
Better? Hold on. How is it now?
Yeah, it's still staticky.
Okay, it's sometimes my computer is doing this, and I may need to boot out and then come back in. But someone else can take this question for a minute, and then I can tell you a little bit about the history when I return.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Dr. Lee, let's go to you next, if there's any response that you have that you would like to share. And I can repeat if you need.
Are you referring to the question for Dr. Walters?
Yeah, so just like your experience, and anything else that you'd like to mention about the COVID-19 prevention network, and just, what that means and the importance of it. Yeah.
So I believe the first time we met as a panel was in July, and that's when they had the 12 of us, including Dr. Wilson, who, as you mentioned, is the director of the Tribal Health Research Office, come together and review our first phase 3 trial. And when I agreed to join the panel, I didn't really quite know what I was getting into, because I think you're right. This is maybe the first time that they've engaged Indigenous research at this level, but I found it very exciting and informative, and actually an honor to be on this panel with some of my colleagues, individuals like Dr. Herring and Dr. Walters, who I've looked up to throughout my career so far. And so I'm sure Dr. Walters will expand more on this, but for what we were doing is we would receive the materials from the 5 vaccine clinical trials that are being organized underneath the COVIPN, or the Coronavirus Prevention Network. And I'm not sure if we provided you with, I think you have the website for that if you want to share it. And so what we would do is we would review the protocol. We would also review the consent form that was going to be used in the clinical trial, and then some of the educational materials, as Dr. Herring alluded to, and then even some of the phase 1 and the phase 2 preliminary studies that may have been reported. And that allowed us to have a better picture of what the phase 3 trials were going to entail, their inclusion for participants. And again, Dr. Herring alluded to the fact that, cancer patients were often not included in these clinical trials. So we don't really have a good idea of how these vaccines could impact cancer patients at this time. And so again, we met in July for their first session, but that was, I believe, the day the Moderna trials kicked off. And then we continued to review the same information for the four other trials. And so, Dr. Walters, I don't know if you want to try your audio now.
How's this? Is this sounding any better? Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, I feel like I'm having that CNN moment that everyone worries about having when the audio goes. I just wanted to give a really brief history, a little bit about these panels, because I think it's actually really critical to acknowledge that the government is being responsive to our sovereignty issues with respect to this. They came about in part because Dr. Bonnie Duran and I, who were connected to the COPN networks, they reached out to us to see if we can recruit more American Indian Alaska Native people into vaccine trials. We raised a concern, and I even talked with Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings about this as well. And, you know, you never know, it doesn't hurt to ask for something. And in this case, it worked. We said, well, before we can really outreach to our communities, we need to address and really have an expert panel to look at these vaccines, because they're different vaccines. We don't know the impact on our communities, and there is justifiable mistrust given the history of medical and vaccine and other kinds of abuses in our communities. And for this to have any kind of credibility and also legitimacy in our communities, we want assurances that Native expert scientists are reviewing these materials. And then, you know, communities can then make an informed decision at the tribal level to support this, but also even at the body sovereignty level, people individually can make decisions about whether this is right for them or not. So we put that forward, and Dr. Michelle Andrazik, who is the COPN community lead, took that directly to Dr. Fauci, and he said, this is a great idea. We totally stand behind it. And not only for Native panelists, but also we need to create this for all of the racial ethnic groups, not just tribal, as well as for older populations who are disproportionately affected and may have some particular needs as well. And that happened right away. And so that was very exciting. And it's the first time really to get top level Native scientists, biologists, immunologists, virologists, behavioral scientists, ethicists, all sitting together, reviewing all of these vaccine trials. And as Dr. Herring had pointed out, we made some recommendations based on our review of the science. And some folks were responsive, some folks not as responsive. But nevertheless, it gave us confidence to be able to say to our communities, this is what we think, you know, these are the kind of questions you should be asking if asked to participate in a clinical trial of this nature. Now we're in a different place, and now the vaccines are launched. And now we have another set of questions that I'm sure the communities may start asking and are asking about safety and efficacy of these vaccines for our communities, which I think are really important questions. But that's a little bit about the history, and I think it's important to recognize that the government quickly responded in a way that I think was responsive to our tribal sovereignty, and are working very closely with Dave Wilson and the Tribal Health Research Office to ensure tribes have immediate answers when questions are raised. And maybe you guys already said that, but hopefully anything else that you want to cover on that, please feel free.
Thank you so much for that perspective and insight and the history behind that. I think it's so important to, you know, be transparent with people about what these processes look like and what the involvement is. And so again, you know, we really appreciate your involvement and dedication to this work. I have a couple more questions here for us to get through. And so the next question I had was for Dr. Lee. What should standards or general practice be moving forward for organizations, agencies, or healthcare systems that want tribes or Native people to participate in clinical trials look like?
Right, thank you again for that question. So Dr. Herring and Dr. Walters alluded to a few of the key topics, and so that included designing culturally relevant materials to engage our diverse communities. And so I think one step that could be taken, and that's working with organizations such as the American Indian Cancer Foundation or researchers who are experts in designing these materials so that we can actually represent our different populations. However, in the beginning of the phase 3 clinical trials, when we were first meeting the COVID-PN, our panel, we submitted a letter to Dr. Slawi, Collins, and Fauci. And Dr. Slawi is the scientific leader for the Operation Warp Speed, if you're not aware. In the letter, we expressed our concerns, and we also provided recommendations regarding the 3 clinical trials that we reviewed at that time, and that was the Moderna, the AstraZeneca, and the Sanofi trials. And so these recommendations are ones that I think may exemplify good practice and probably or possibly build back some of that trust that Dr. Herring spoke about earlier. And so, for example, one of our concerns was the lack of gender and age and race targets from these sponsors, right? It was very unclear that they were actually trying to engage and reach out to Native communities and actually set a target. And so therefore the recommendation to the trial sponsors was to set recruitment targets for these different age and race and gender groups. Another concern was the high burden of clinical trials that may have on individuals, especially from remote areas, which is a lot of our Indigenous population. So we have our urban, but we also have our rural population, and how that can be affected when they have limited means of transportation. So most of the trials required multiple visits, and cancer trials in the future and other trials will also likely require multiple visits to a clinic site. And so therefore, one of the recommendations and what they're working on now are developing these mobile units or these mobile clinics that can now go out into the communities so individuals can actually participate in the different clinical trials. So again, that should be something that should be, more standard practice as we want to engage Indigenous communities. And then a third one was relating to transparency and the messaging regarding inclusion of vulnerable and at-risk populations, right? This goes back to the idea that, we don't want to be treated as guinea pigs. So the sponsor should really be clear about why it's important for them to also have a diverse population included in their clinical trials. And this kind of goes back to why we should have relevant cultural materials developed for future practices. And then again, Dr. Herring also alluded to the fact that we have tribal sovereignty. This was a very specific concern to our panel because it was almost as if it wasn't even considered or thought about in the clinical design. And it was actually quite surprising and alarming. And so over the years, right, the federal government has made strides in regards to research and data sovereignty in tribal communities, but it wasn't really evident in these trial sponsors who again are private companies. So again, having that education and knowing that this is something that should be and needs to be included when working with tribal communities. And so again, these recommendations aren't just specific to what we provided for the COVID vaccines, but should be applied to future clinical trials. However, they might not be feasible. For example, maybe the use of a mobile van, it may help reduce participant burden. It's not entirely going to help in the case of specialty equipment that maybe can't be mobilized. And so this is just a few suggestions or recommendations that we provided. And actually, Dr. Tabak, who is the Deputy Director of the NIH, responded to our letter. And essentially, in summary, he talked about the NIH and their actions to create the Community Engagement Alliance, or referred to as CEAL, CEAL. And so NAU and U of A and other partners here in Arizona, we're one of those NIH grant receiving, that we received the grant. And so the CEAL is essentially intended to leverage the relationships that universities or other organizations have among researchers or health departments, or trusted even local leaders, to identify appropriate strategies. And again, this should be something I think we should continue as we think about future future trials. And then they had a few other recommendations. Dr. Tabak had a few other suggestions, but they're not necessarily required from these sponsors or going to be enforced. And so these included just some fundamentals around increasing representation and participation in trials, such as diversity training for the PIs, things like that.
Thank you so much for that. That perspective. I think that's so important to help provide that, to the partners and collaborators that are reaching out. I know, there have been some different requests that we've been receiving about how to help increase that, awareness and participation of Native people in clinical trials. So thank you for sharing those things. And then I'll open this question to, anyone that wants to respond here. About kind of taking it a step further and then and saying that, what are things that or organizations like AICAF or the Tribal Chairman's Health Leaders Board or Roswell Parks, as those connectors or those in-between people, what can we do to help advocate or be a better connector for the tribes and tribal communities as we think about increasing that awareness for American Indian, Alaska Native participation in these trials? What can our role be and how can we better increase awareness? So anyone that would like to respond to that?
Well, I think you're doing a great job. And I shared this with your executive director there some time back, is that, when I go to our Indian Health Service Center, I see your materials on the counter, and they're just there, like it wasn't through our efforts that they got there, but it was good to see the reach that you have. And, so, what I think is important is that we support each other in that way. That any differences that nations have with each other or urban organizations, that those be set aside, that we work together to get through this together as one, with our collective knowledges and collective sciences and good minds, that we put those all together and continue that pathway. And we've learned a lot, about how to communicate with each other virtually. This would never happen 6 months ago. I didn't even hear the word Zoom. I didn't even know what that meant, But now we're professionals, right? We're professionals on these multiple platforms. So, we need to continue that kind of working together with a good mind, a collective mind, and when we see our neighbor nations struggling, that we help them out too. If we have education, that we provide that, we include them in the conversation, and I even go beyond that with our adjacent non-native communities, because when they're healthy, many of our people go to services off territory or in the cities, that they have to be part of that conversation too. And so it's important to share that knowledge beyond and be inclusive of our conversations too with those that we work with. So that I think that's really important to keep that going. And we've seen that with the work that we're doing too, is that when a nation asks for materials or education, whether it's local or regional or global, that we try to be responsive to that. And you'll see that with the work with the infographic that we created, that's national. It's when we provide clinical trial information, we have a regional focus, but when it's also intertribal, it's national. And beyond that, we've had conversations with our Indigenous relations in the Maori of New Zealand, for example, who have been pretty successful as a country and as a Maori nation there with their work with the pandemic. So we keep an open ear to that, and with our hopes to share that knowledge here at home and then with other tribes across the country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee or Dr. Walters. Anything else that you want to add? And I'm also going to, in the meantime, share a resource that we just put out on making sure that you still get your screenings. So this is available on our website, something on our social media site as well. And we'll send this out as well as some of the other resources that have been shared and mentioned here. But yeah, Dr. Lee and Dr. Walters, anything else that you have to add on that question?
I'm good.
have to, agree with Dr. Herring that you guys are doing a great job, and having champions, not just for research, but also clinical trials, is going to bring back some of that trust and that awareness within our communities, and also sending positive messaging that there are Indigenous researchers out there. We are working in these areas. We're here to help our communities. It's not just, that Western science anymore. You have the Indigenous perspectives being brought to the table at these large national levels, especially now through the organization and the help of the Tribal Health Research Office at the NIH.
I think that's an excellent point, Naomi. I think it's really critical that we not only understand that Indigenous researchers and scientists have been at the helm more, that also helps us understand an important component, which is there are real barriers for some of our communities, and that even if, let's say, a tribal community says, yeah, I want to go do this clinical trial, Native people also have their own body sovereignty. They have the right to say whether or not they want to participate in that particular trial. The key thing is ensuring that our communities are really informed, and I think that that's the critical piece, so that people can make decisions that are right for themselves and for their families and their communities. And so, yeah, that's all I just wanted to add to it.
Awesome. Thank you all for your responses on that, and thank you for your support in the work that we do here. So the last question that I had here was for Dr. Walters. If you could provide a brief overview of, some of the different types of vaccines that we're seeing, such as the Moderna and Pfizer that we're hearing about on the news regarding the COVID-19 vaccine, would be great. Also, we were getting a little bit of feedback again from your mic. It wasn't terrible. We could still make out the words, but let's see if it's okay.
Okay. I'm just going to just say something quickly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Naomi, who has more expertise in explaining the mRNA technology that's being used in the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, which is really exciting. It's new and it actually has implications for cancer research down the line in cancer trials. But just the important point to the takeaway here is that it's very exciting because both the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines look like they're reflecting about a 95% efficacy. So about 95% of the people who received the vaccine were protected against the disease. So what that basically means is that 90 people in the placebo arm got sick, but only 5 in the treatment arm got sick. So that was an incredible finding to happen so quickly. I know somebody asked the question, how did that happen so quickly? And just by way of background, people have been studying coronaviruses for a while. People have been really working on developing this new technology. The timing was just right, and it just happened to work. But there had been a number of years of build-up to get to this point. It wasn't like we just developed it out of nowhere. There's been a lot of work in this area. Though, and this is the part that I think people don't quite understand, is that the studies only measured whether vaccinated people developed symptoms, not whether they got infected. So in other words, if the person was asymptomatic in that study, we don't know. So we don't know. There could be a possibility that people with no symptoms or mild symptoms, which we know is one of the hallmarks of this disease spreading very quickly, right? They actually, you could still be infected. So it helps stop severe disease, it looks like, and that's true for AstraZeneca as well. And Moderna seems to be pretty effective with respect to not progressing to severe disease, but it doesn't. At least we don't know right now whether it prevents you from actually getting the infection. So it's important to be cautious and continue to wear masks until more data comes out on that. Just like hot off the press, Moderna is starting to show, however, that after one shot, there's a one shot, even when vaccination can actually possibly reduce transmission of asymptomatic infection. It was reduced by 63%. So there is some hopeful data that's coming out that shows that it reduces the possibility of spread of infection. But again, that's still being demonstrated. In terms of side effects, fever, chills, headaches, you will get a little bit of those symptoms. About 9% of the cases got more intense reactions, like really, kind of feeling, kind of needing to take a day off of work, for example, for a day. The other thing to highlight is that the Pfizer vaccine did have, and it's not unusual when you start to go to scale, to have some people who you start finding some of the rare responses that people do have. And so we're starting to document that. So what they're suggesting is people with severe allergies, people who have had anaphylaxis reactions before, because there were 2 cases of anaphylactic reactions with the Pfizer vaccine, they're recommending holding off right now for folks who have had those kinds of responses to not take the Pfizer vaccine. And they're seeing a little bit of 3 cases of Bell's palsy-like responses with the Moderna vaccine. Again, that's super rare. And they're just watching for that right now to see if it's a super rare event or not. And it's, that's not atypical. We see that even with the flu vaccine, right? People can sometimes have a rare event in those cases. So I'll turn it over to Naomi if she wants to add a little bit about this new technology, because it is different and it's pretty exciting.
Can you bring up the cheat sheet website that I sent to you all? And again, this cheat sheet will be available to everybody that is viewing, and hopefully that you'll post it on your website. But essentially, it gives a really good summary of the current vaccines that are in phase 3 that are coming essentially through the pipeline. And so this includes the Moderna and the Pfizer. And so just a little caveat, right? Us, the co-VPN, the Indigenous panel, we reviewed 5 phase 3 clinical trials that did not include the Pfizer, because the Pfizer was not initially part of the Operation Warp Speed, while they are part of the distribution plan. So the Moderna and the Pfizer are very similar in technology, though, in the way the clinical trials were actually designed. So again, this is available to everybody. It talks about so you can see AstraZeneca on the top, Moderna, and then Pfizer. So I'll just really speak to the Moderna and Pfizer. So as a biochemist, obviously I get excited about chemicals and biology and DNA and RNA, but I'll try to keep my excitement down, right? And so Dr. Walters, and you might have seen this on the news, right? Why is this new technology? It's new technology in the sense for vaccines. It's old technology in the sense of biochemists or molecular biologists, right? We've known about mRNA. People have been trying to use mRNA for different therapeutics, but it was trying to create the mRNA so that it's stable, right? So RNA is essentially, we have our DNA that is then converted into different forms of RNA, structurally very similar, but they have different functions. And so if we were to just immunize with just mRNA, right, it would essentially, our body would recognize it as foreign, it would break it down. It's not very stable. However, over the years, that's where they have learned to develop more of this sort of nanotechnology, or what they call these lipid nanoparticles. They're made out of lipids which are in our body. And those essentially enclose the mRNA so that we can then deliver it into our body through an immunization, and then it can get into our cells. So once the mRNA is in our cells, we are then able to take our cells and make proteins of interest, right? And the protein that they're targeting is called the spike protein. And as Dr. Walters alluded to, we have known about coronaviruses. The spike protein was a target for the SARS-CoV-1. It's very similar to the structure of it for the SARS-CoV-1. And so this technology, this information was already known. It was once they had that genetic information available, they were quickly able to then take it, apply it to this technology that we've technically had, just not in the form of a vaccine, and develop a vaccine relatively quickly and use all the assays, sort of those preclinical assays or experiments that they were already working on in these different companies. And so mRNA, that's what makes our proteins in our body, right? It's encoding for a protein. And so Dr. Walters also alluded to that this could not be used for many different diseases. So in my lab, we target different proteins related to multiple diseases. So cancers, cardiovascular disease, infectious diseases, right? So this could be a new booming technology that could be applied to many, many different diseases. It's just this happens to be the first time it's coming in the form of a vaccine and being made available to everybody as a therapeutic.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those responses. So we are right at 2 o'clock right now. And so I did want to go back to a couple of the questions that we got, if that's okay. If you guys need to jump off and have other things, we certainly understand and want to respect your time. So if we could answer a couple of questions that have come up here in the chat box, and you guys may have gotten these as well. There's some that are coming through on Facebook. Have you discussed strategies to ensure our Indigenous relatives are completing the vaccine series once available in your conversations that you've been having?
I'll take a short answer to that one. I think that's the next conversation. The release of the vaccines came recently, and so we haven't discussed that, but in full. But I think that's the next conversations we're having about dissemination and next steps. And so I think that's forthcoming. And that's important to understand that and you'll see and you'll read in some of the information that's coming out. When tribes again have that sovereignty to select what vaccine they want to administer, whether it be one or multiple. But it's important to understand that when you start one regimen of a vaccine, that that's the one you have to stick with. And so tribes have that sovereign right to pick which vaccine is coming into their communities. And the dissemination piece and supply of the vaccine is, I think, in the next conversation piece.
Just going to add, I think they're already starting to have some of those conversations with the Tribal Health Research Office as well. The big issue is refrigeration and the level of, for the Pfizer vaccine, you need to keep it at a certain temperature, and that's really difficult potentially in some of our communities. So that may determine a little bit which vaccine would be most appropriate for our communities in more rural locations. So.
Another question was a 95% efficacy rate in a small amount of time seems pretty high. How do we get there?
I think that Dr. Lee did a great job of kind of telling a little bit about that history. We're already kind of poised and set to launch into this, and so they were able to determine that very quickly. We don't have, and that's for overall participants. In terms, it looks like, for example, Moderna has done well across ethnicities and different groups. Again, I would have liked to have seen higher numbers of our communities in there. What makes me feel a little bit more confident that it'll translate okay into our communities better is the fact that, for example, some of them have pretty good African American size samples, and African Americans and American Indians both have to deal with the same kinds of health disparities and health risks that we would be worried about that would be triggered with the vaccine, right? So high rates of hypertension and diabetes, things like that. So the fact that it's performing well across all of those communities gives me a little bit more confidence that we'll do okay as well. So Dr. Lee or Dr. Herring, if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I think another thing too, you bring up co-occurring conditions, and that was one of the things that we kind of brought forward, that we wanted to make sure in the forefront of the trials that the companies that were aware that some of these disparities were existing in our communities over time, and that we wanted to make sure that they were aware of that. And so I think there was a greater increase because of that for co-occurring conditions like diabetes and heart disease that were kind of brought into those trials that may have not been there before. So you're right, that's important. So we know that those pieces are kind of translate across disparities, translate to other communities, and it was an important thing, we thought, to have that kind of be part of the trials and going forward as well.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, our panel brought up the issue of HIV and making sure people who are living with HIV have access to these trials at first, and some of them they did not, and they were responsive and started doing more outreach to immunosuppressed populations as well. Part of it was to see, does this vaccine impact people negatively who have immunosuppression, or if they have multiple health conditions, and so they were responsive, at least in terms of.
So we are about 5 minutes over on time here, so just want to ask any last thoughts or comments that any of the panelists that you all would like to make.
I think one of the concerns people have is just the name of Operation Warp Speed, right? How we're, scientists or these pharmaceutical companies are pushing everything through. The science isn't good. In fact, the fact that we have these panels might be even making it better, right? They're having these Indigenous perspectives that they never had before. And so when I talked about the phases of the clinical trials previously, right, traditionally they're in stages. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, right? But with the coronavirus, because of this pandemic, they staggered the stages a little bit. So once they reached a point where they had enough data, they showed safety, right? They showed efficacy. They moved on to the next phase. So they technically did not skip any of the phases that we typically see in a clinical trial. It's just they were more staggered so we could get to the phase 3 to actually look at the placebo versus a control. So where we're at now with many of these. And it should also be pointed out that these companies, the Corona or the HIV network, that is the vaccine network that is organizing a lot of this through Fred Hutch Cancer Center, they have been doing clinical trials for a very long time. This is not new to them running a clinical trial. They already have a lot of the expertise in how to set up an appropriate clinical trial. Now they get the fact that they have these panels providing their feedback and guiding them on how to engage these at-risk or diverse populations.
So one last question was, are any of the panel sessions recorded for community review or an opportunity to see that information?
To my knowledge, they are not recorded. I'm sure we have notes taken. We have put out recently a letter that's about the, I think Dr. Herring and Dr. Lee know as well, that basically summarizes some of our thoughts on some things. Hopefully that's been posted now to the COVID-19 website. And we can double check and follow up on that to make sure that it is posted.
Yeah, I just switched my shared screen here to that. This is the co-VPN website with some information and resources there. So, and again, we'll send out an email with the resources that we've covered and links to some of these websites. And so unless anyone has any other last minute words they would like to share.
The panel or the sessions weren't recorded because some of the discussions we had included priority information, and some of the clinical trials hadn't even started, right? And so, but the products that are coming out of CoVPN. So some of these informations, educational materials, the CoVPN has a YouTube channel with videos. These are some of the products that we had a voice in.
All right.
I'll just send the last Nyawe to, our communities helped us reach this education level we're at, and to have the voice, all our voices together in the same room and honored that way. It's been really it's been something, right? So we've been everybody on the Indigenous panel has been reflective of what we would call a good mind, and that we've all, all have good thoughts, and our education and our Indigenous knowledges kind of all blend into that. And so it's been pretty powerful. We've been training for this our whole life, both in the Indigenous context and in the Western context. And it isn't without our community support of our education and our work together with our communities and our knowledges that have been shared from everyone in our communities and our teams that we work with at work, really makes this something special. So we're very, very appreciative of the opportunity to represent that way, and it's been a good, interesting kind of process to have our voices heard at that level. So Nyawe, from the community.
And I just echo what Dr. Herring just shared. Okay, thank you for allowing us to be able to share some of the work that we've been engaged in. That, as Dr. Herring has acknowledged, this work stems from our community involvement and being connected to our communities. And I do think everyone brought their good mind, their good hearts to this, but also their experience, both professional as well as cultural, to bear on some of the issues. And there were times we were fighters, and other times we were able to work hand in hand with some of the issues that African American communities were raising concerns, or our elders were raising that were concerns. So I think it was very important, and it was a good demonstration, a good practice that I hope that the NIH will continue to do for future clinical trials. And again, okay, for everybody and their expert knowledge, both cultural and their professional knowledge too. So these things are walking together in a good way. And we're just honored to be of service to our communities. Okay, thank you.
Right. So I also want to mention again, that there was another live discussion that was going on with Dr. Anthony Fauci from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and Dr. David Wilson from the NIH Tribal Health Research Office to discuss the COVID-19 research and vaccines for American Indians and Alaska Natives. I'm told that the session is also has been recorded and should be available, I'm guessing, on their Facebook page. So that's just the either the Facebook page for the Tribal Health Research Office, as well as the NIH page on Facebook is where I saw it. So we would encourage you to watch that because I'm sure there's some important information there as well. And so again, just want to say a huge thank you to our guests, Dr. Naomi Lee, Dr. Karina Walters, and Dr. Rodney Herring for taking the time to share with us this important information regarding clinical trial participation for our relatives, as well as, to all you listeners for joining us today. We're so thankful for this time with you, and we hope you're all staying safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again on a future webinar. Wopida.